So let me wrap up just a little early there, if we're able, and shift to our first session. We have several speakers today. All of them are in the room except for one person, Brian Schaffner, who's our next speaker who couldn't be with us. But I think you're going to enjoy his presentation. It's really going to set the stage for the rest of today. So let me welcome to the podium to do an introduction and moderate this session my colleague, Eleanor Powell from the Department of Political Science. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm thrilled to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Professor Brian Schaffner. He is the holds the Newhouse Professorship of Civic Studies at Tufts University. He's a leading scholar of public opinion, campaigns, elections, and political parties. He's the author of 7 books and 50 referee journal articles. I won't give you his full resume because it's too long here to discuss, but his most recent book is from Cambridge University Press on hometown inequality, race, class, and representation in American local politics. In addition to all that, he's also one of the co-principal investigators of the Cooperative Election Study, which is one of the most important ongoing surveys of American politics. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Schaffner.
Thank you very much for that, and I'm very sad not to be there in person. Trust me, I would love to be there, but unfortunately, we are dealing with some complicated medical issues with our daughter. Nothing life-threatening, but kind of more annoying than anything else. But I'm very happy to be able to join remotely today. And what I'm going to talk about is a book project I'm working on with the other person who I've been co-directing the Cooperative Election Study with, Stephen and Salbaher, which we're calling the American Mosaic. And I'm hoping that we can use some of these insights from what we've been doing to try to better understand the 2024 election and maybe how we see things going forward as well. So the way I think I want to start is to talk about sort of how we experience campaigns as we read the news during the campaign itself. And so, and really what our book is about is, first and foremost, is how the various identities that we have as people, the extent to which they predict our vote choices and our issue positions and our politics in general. And one thing that we're kind of interested in is how the news media, scholars, interest groups, political consultants, et cetera, mostly sort of focus on one of these dimensions at a time in a way that I think probably makes us think that we are very different from the other side in almost every way. So you can think about discussions of the urban-rural divide. You can think about discussions of the diploma divide. You can think about discussions of the gender gap, how different generations are voting, and so forth and so on. In the 2024 campaign, this is just based on some content analysis that one of my research assistants did of New York Times articles. You could see how much discussion was being paid to various groups of potential voters during the campaign. So these are all stories that happened before the election, during the 2024 campaign. At the top, you see that the New York Times spent a lot of time talking about Black voters. As I'm going to show you, I think that was actually a good call. They spent a lot of time talking about women voters, Hispanic voters, rural voters, so forth and so on. And you can sort of look all the way down this list and see there's some groups that really don't get much mention at all. So, and actually some groups that are pretty, as I'll show you, are pretty important that really don't get much attention in the news media. The reason I show this is to say, like, there are lots of things out there that people sort of focus on as important predictors of what divides us when it comes to politics. And one of the things that we're really aiming to do with this book is kind of sort through all of those. And so one thing we really want to know is sort of which social identities really matter for how we vote. Which are the most important, which are less important. And what we want to know is sort of what's the picture of America that emerges by dividing us into the different combinations of those identities. So if we take all the most important identities and divide up the electorate into pieces based on each unique combination of those, what does that look like? And can we make any sense of that picture? And so then sort of the next step of our book is to say, so what lessons can we learn from this American mosaic, the mosaic picture of politics that we create from this? So the way we can do this is that we're using the Cooperative Election Study data. And for those who don't know about it, it's a very large survey of American voters that we have been conducting every year since 2006. Most of the recent election cycles include interviews with 60,000 American adults before and after the election. So over the time span of this study, we've actually interviewed well over 500,000 Americans. So we have very big samples, which is important because if we're going to slice up the electorate, we need to have big samples so that we can do that. We also know a lot about each of our respondents. So it's a fairly long survey. We ask lots of questions. So we don't just sort of know age, race, gender, but we also ask people if they're in a union, if they're a member of the military, what's their occupation, so forth and so on. So we know a lot about these people. We also ask them a lot of questions about policy positions. So we have generally, our aim has been to ask about the issues that are currently being debated in Congress, in DC, in the states, and ask people what their positions are on all those issues. And then finally, we also take the data and match it back to voter files after the election to see who actually voted, and so that we can actually distinguish voters from non-voters. So we haven't been able to do that for 2024 yet, but for the election cycles that come before 2024, we actually know who are the voters and who aren't voting. So the first thing we want to do when we're taking this data is to say, what actually matters when it comes to vote choice. So let's take all these different social identities that we have as individuals and see which ones are the most important. And the way we do that is we have lots of data. We know lots of things about each of the people in our data set. And we essentially run basically a complicated machine learning technique, but the basic idea is to say, if you throw all these things into a model without any real assumptions about sort of how they're constructed, et cetera, and if you remove one of these items one at a time, how much worse does the model do predicting how someone will vote? Okay, and so if you remove an item and the model does much worse predicting how someone will vote, then that tells you that identity is really important when it comes to predicting vote choice. So we've done this for each of the elections going back to 2008. And so what I'm going to show you here is the relative importance of all these different variables, essentially, when it comes to predicting vote choice. So I think one of the striking things about this graph is that there are basically two things that stand alone in terms of predicting how people vote in elections, and that's religion and race ethnicity. Okay, so far and away, those are the two most important things. And then you have all this other host of things that, again, you probably read lots of stories about in the newspaper, see lots of stories about on television, but actually those things are much less important in terms of predicting how someone's going to vote. So again, it sort of goes back and forth, but it's basically religion or race in every election going back to 2008, which is the most important, with the other factor pretty close in terms of its predictive capability. And then after that, you see sexual identity, education, generation looks like it was more important in this election than it has been in previous ones. Same with the urban-rural divide. Marital status has been more important in previous elections, also important in this election. So we can kind of sort through this data and say, like, what are the most important identities? Obviously, there's two that stand out, but then maybe we can pull in some others. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take our data. We're going to combine several election cycles. And what we want to do is divide the population using each unique combination of the 6 what we identify as sort of the 6 most important identities. You could sort of flip others in as you want, but this basically creates a reasonable picture of what's the most important things predicting vote choice. And so essentially what we're doing is we're saying for each respondent, we're identifying their unique traits on all 6 of these dimensions. So how they identify in terms of race, ethnicity, how they identify in terms of religion, sexual identity, education, gender, and marital status. And each of these unique combinations is a different tile in our mosaic. So for example, my tile would be as a white, Jewish, heterosexual married man with a postgraduate degree. That's not a very big segment of the American population, I'll tell you right now. Maybe a bigger segment of the, I don't know, academic population. What do we get when we do this? We get this mosaic. So this is not every tile that emanates from those unique combinations of categories. There would actually be about 1,300 different tiles. What we do is we're going to limit this to make it manageable and take the 361 biggest tiles. So that's what you're seeing here. The 361 biggest tiles account for about 92% of the adult population in America. So this is basically most of America right here. And each tile in this image is, again, a unique combination of those 6 identities. So the bottom left red tile is the biggest tile in this map. It accounts for 2.8% of the American population. And that tile are white, heterosexual, married women with a high school degree or less who are evangelical. Okay, so that's the biggest segment of the American population on those identities. And then the top right, the smallest tile of the 361, are Asian, heterosexual, unmarried women with college degrees. That very tiny tile on the top right votes 90% Democratic. And by vote here, basically what we're doing is we're taking not just how they vote in one race, but how they vote in all the races we ask about. So how they vote for president, House, Senate, governor, and so on. And the bottom right tile, which is the biggest tile, votes 87% Republican. So you can see these tiles are shaded based on how Democratic or Republican they vote. You see a lot of, well, actually not that many red tiles perhaps, but pretty big red tiles. You see a lot of maybe smaller blue tiles. I'll say that the 10 largest tiles, so the ones that go down on the left side and then along the bottom most of the way, those 10 largest tiles, each of those is, the thing that is in common among all those is that they are evangelical, each one of those tiles. Okay. And they all are overwhelmingly Republican. But to put this in starker relief, let's just isolate the tiles that vote at least 70% Republican. And so those are these tiles. Okay, there's actually just 38 tiles out of the 361 that vote 70% Republican or more in elections. You're seeing those now. Most of those actually, though, are actually pretty big. And as a combination, they account for about 27% of the American population. So these 38 most Republican tiles account for over 1/4 of the adult population. And then we can add in the tiles that are voting 70% or more Democratic in elections. And you can see there's a lot more of those. There's actually about 198 vote Democratic at least 70% of the time. Again, those account for about 27% of the population. The thing you'll notice here is that there's a lot more blue tiles, but they're a lot smaller. There's many fewer red tiles, but they're a lot bigger, right? In fact, the red tiles are on average about 5 times larger than the blue tiles. And so I think that brings us to the first lesson that we get from the American Mosaic, something that I think we know generally about the parties, but I think this puts into stark relief, which is that the Republican Party is much more homogenous when it comes to identity than the Democratic Party, okay? that they can be categorized by this much smaller number of much bigger tiles, whereas Democrats are much more of a melting pot when it comes to these identities. Okay, so the thing about a mosaic is it's not just a jumble of tiles or pieces. It's meant to be a jumble of tiles and pieces that actually form a picture. So how can we form a picture about American politics from these pieces that helps us better understand sort of what's going on with polarization, but also what's going on with sort of who wins and loses elections in America? So what we're going to do is try to start rearranging the tiles. And so the first thing I'm going to do is basically rearrange the tiles based on 5 racial ethnic groups. Okay, so basically what I've done here is rearrange the tiles so that all the tiles that represent white people are in one block, all the tiles representing Black people are in one block, Hispanic people, Asian people, and then the top right there is just everyone else who doesn't identify with one of those 4 groups. Okay, and I think what we see when we do this is that there is one block that is pretty homogenous in terms of how they vote, and that's Black people, right? So you can see that the bottom right there, it's all pretty blue. There's not much variance in terms of how those pieces in that block are voting. Whereas in the others groups, including like Hispanic and Asian, there are some red tiles, a lot of purple tiles. And so what we're going to start what we're going to start by doing is saying like, okay, one group of tiles that's clearly important and significant here are Black people, and let's set them aside, okay? These other groups aren't necessarily super predictive of how people are going to vote because there's a mixture of voting patterns in those groups. And so let's go to the next thing, which is religion. So let's set Black people aside and then divide everyone else based on their religious categories. And we've kind of like simplified to some extent the religious categories here. But we have evangelical, other Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, other, nothing in particular, and then atheist and agnostic. Okay, now again, Black people are set aside regardless of what religion they are. And so now we're just dividing anyone who's not Black into these religious categories. And what I think really emerges here is you get 3 groups that are pretty predictive of how people are going to vote, right? So evangelicals, there are a couple of blue squares, small blue tiles there, a couple of small purple tiles, but overwhelmingly very Republican. This is not news, I don't think, to anyone here. I think the other 2 groups that we see that are pretty clearly solid are atheists and agnostic. They're voting very much Democratic. Both of those groups, when you combine them, are well over 70% Democratic in terms of how they vote. So we're going to combine atheists and agnostic individuals and call them seculars. And we're also going to set aside evangelicals. And then the last group that we're going to look at here is sexual identity. So we're going to basically take what's left after you take Black people, secular people, evangelical people, and then divide by sexual identity. And what we basically end up with is, and this is sort of our final picture that I'm going to show you of the mosaic in terms of how people vote, is what we call the big 4 polarizing groups, okay? And we call them the big 4 polarizing groups because they're groups that are both big enough in size to be important in terms of how elections turn out, and vote overwhelmingly enough in one direction or the other that they really do polarize voting. And so you have, on one hand, white evangelicals who vote overwhelmingly Republican, well over 70% Republican, grouped there on the top left. You have LGBTQ on the top right. And again, those are LGBTQ people who don't fall into one of those other 3 groups. And then Black people and secular people. These are sort of 3 Democratic, heavily voting Democratic groups. And then we have the tiles that don't fall into any of those 3 categories that end up in the bottom left there, which we call the mosaic middle. The mosaic middle is much more purple. There are definitely some red tiles and there are definitely some blue tiles. There's nothing really that unifies them in any clear way for us, at least based on the identities we're looking at here. And we call the Mosaic middle the middle because it's mostly purple. In fact, if you look at how the Mosaic middle votes in these elections across these 4 election cycles, across a bunch of elections, it's basically 50-50. The point I want to make about the big 4 polarizers is that if you categorize someone based on one of those 4 groups, okay, you can predict with about 85% accuracy who that individual is going to vote for. So if you say, oh, I think all Black people are going to vote Democratic, I think all secular people are going to vote Democratic, I think all white evangelical people are going to vote Republican, and I think all LGBTQ people are going to vote Democratic, you would be right 85% of the time. And that's pretty good. That's basically like if you knew how those people said, what people said their ideology was, you'd do about the same. It's the Mosaic middle that's hard to predict, right? They're a mix, and they're much harder to predict. Okay, so that brings us to the second lesson, which is that it's maybe a bit of a controversial claim, but we're basically saying that there are just these 4 groups who are large enough and vote one-sided enough to really define our contemporary polarization. Okay, those 4 groups I just described, we call them the big 4 polarizers. And they actually account for over half of the American population, those 4 groups. Okay, and they vote very clearly one direction or the other. As a brief aside, I think often I get questions like how much overlap are there between those categories? And keep in mind that there is sometimes a lot of overlap. So for example, a lot of Black people are evangelical, but Black evangelical people for us end up in the Black square because basically the Black identity overrides the evangelical identity. Black evangelicals vote about as Democratic as Black people who are not evangelicals. Whereas if you look at, for example, there are about 3% of the American population are identified both as LGBTQ and evangelical. Those individuals are more mixed in how they vote. They're sort of about 50-50. But then everyone else who's LGBTQ votes very much Democratic. And then, of course, there's a little bit of overlap between secular identity and LGBTQ status. Right. So one thing we want to do is, we think these big 4 groups are interesting. We also think the Mosaic middle is interesting. And we kind of want to look at how those groups have evolved over time, because I think there's a really interesting story there. So unfortunately, we only have Cooperative Election Study data for presidential elections going back to 2008. But what we've done is go back to the exit polls and do the best job we could with the exit polls of reconstructing these groups going all the way back to 1980. And I think there's a few interesting things that happen when we do that. So one is that you can see that if you go all the way back to 1980, there's really not much of a religion divide in terms of how people are voting. So people who identified as atheist or agnostic in 1980 are about 50-50 between Reagan and Carter. And Carter actually does pretty well among white evangelicals as well. But you can see that divide begin to grow over time. And a lot of what's going on there is that the secular population is becoming much more democratic over time, steadily more democratic over those decades, and it's becoming much bigger over time. And so I think one important story here is, and I think it really helps us understand a lot about democratic politics right now, is the basically the emergence of this group of secular individuals in the Democratic Party, and how big of a share of the Democratic Party that's becoming. The secular vote in the Democratic Party, the non-Black seculars in the Democratic Party, are now a larger block, it looks like, than Black people in the Democratic Party in terms of accounting for how much for Democratic vote share. And I think that's a really significant development. Another thing you see is that in our preliminary data for 2024, we are showing a pretty big drop off in the Black vote for Democrats. I don't know if that'll totally maintain once we do the vote validation. One thing that we've seen in the past few election cycles is that Black people who, say they're not voting Democratic often end up not voting in our survey. So some of that drop might not really materialize once we match our data to the voter files. But I think you're going to see a drop of some. I think most of the data is suggesting you're going to see a drop of some magnitude. And it would be kind of a watershed election in that it would be the first time that a group other than Black people, so the secular group, is voting more Democratic than Black people are, which I think is also interesting and significant. The other thing I'll note from this graph is that the Mosaic middle is kind of the group that swings elections. So you can see that basically which side that group votes for is the side that wins the election all but once during this period. We don't actually have data for 2000 because problems with the exit polls in that year, but otherwise in the other elections in the cycle, the way the Mosaic middle went is the way the election went, with one exception. Couple of lessons from that then. The big four, I think, really define American polarization and have done so for the last few decades. But who wins and loses is driven by the Mosaic middle. So like that's your swing vote in elections. But also I think from that graph, you can see that the rise of the secular bloc in the Democratic Party has had actually significant implications for the party. And I'm going to show a little bit more on that in a second here. And in fact, I'll do that right now. So what I'm going to show you is using the 2024 data, how each of these groups is distributed when it comes to their positions on 33 different issue questions we asked them about various policies being considered. So we're asking about climate change, we're asking about abortion, we're asking about immigration, we're asking about economic issues, etc. Here we're just going to tally how many times each person took a liberal position on those issues versus a conservative position. And then I'm just going to show you the distributions for each of these 5 groups, the big 4 polarizers and the Mosaic middle. And I think, again, this may sort of fit with your sense of how these groups would look, but I think it's really striking to think about what this means for our politics. So first off, at the top, you have secular individuals. They are overwhelmingly liberal and almost unified in their liberalness. Okay, so they the vertical lines there are just showing you the median individual in that group. So the median individual in that group is taking a liberal position on the issues more than 80% of the time. There's a tail, but there's a very small tail stretching out. LGBTQ individuals, also pretty liberal, a little less so than secular individuals, and a little more variance there. And then I think like what's interesting here are Black people, much more moderate than those two groups, right? And there definitely are some pretty liberal Black people, but also a lot of Black people are much more moderate. In fact, the median for our distribution of Black individuals is very close to the Mosaic middle. So that purple part of America. And then I also think so I think like getting back to the tensions in the party, I think, one of the tensions that the rise of the secular group in the Democratic Party has created is that you have this very liberal group of individuals who are very engaged in politics. And then you have Black people who are also a big part of the party who are more moderate on the policies. And so there is a little bit of policy tension, I think, between those groups. And I think you've started to see that emerge in the last few years. And I think the other interesting thing about this graph is just how much variance there is in terms of white evangelicals. So we know that white evangelicals vote overwhelmingly Republican elections, but there's actually a lot of variance in terms of their beliefs on the issues. So, there are a lot of white evangelicals who are well over 50% of the time taking liberal positions on the issues. There's also a lot who are usually taking conservative positions on the issues, but it's interesting to see that there's almost as much variance in how liberal or conservative evangelicals are on the issues compared to the Mosaic middle. So that's, I think, another interesting aspect of what we're looking at. And so if you recast the American Mosaic, but instead of using vote choice, you use this measure of issue ideology, essentially. The percentage of time someone takes a liberal position, you can see it looks much more purple than the other graph did, right? It's much less reds and blues, more purples. There are definitely still some clear red, big red tiles, really, in the white evangelical block. There's still most of the tiles in the secular block are actually quite blue. But then there's a lot of purple in other areas of the graph, a lot more than I think you see when you look at vote choice. What I would say about this is that another lesson that we're seeing as we look into this is that Americans are actually not that divided on a lot of the issues facing the country. And I think there's actually we can kind of delineate issues where there's more division and issues where there's less. And so issues where we see more division between these groups are things like climate change, immigration, abortion, and crime. When it comes to other aspects of policy, so for example, big ticket economic items, for example, you often see these groups actually aligned together. In fact, when we look at all the issues across several election cycles, several surveys, basically the big four are on the same side of an issue about 30% of the time. So about 30% of the issues we ask about, the big four are all on the same side, which maybe is surprising given how polarized they are in terms of how they vote. And this includes some of the biggest legislation that has been passed in the past few years. So for example, all of the big four groups supported the CARES Act and generally legislation aimed at addressing the COVID pandemic. All of the big four groups supported the infrastructure bill that was passed during the Biden presidency. So a lot of times when Congress is doing like big things like the infrastructure bill, it's actually reflecting the fact that all these groups are aligned on those. And it's actually more on these sort of more cultural issues where you see the bigger divisions. There's also a distinction when it comes to issue priorities. So here we asked people after the 2022 election, what should the top three priorities be for the next Congress? And you can see that like there are some pretty significant differences here. You can also see some of the tensions that we've already talked about in the Democratic Party kind of arising here. For example, the secular and LGBTQ groups see climate change as much more important than, for example, Black people do. On immigration, evangelicals stand out very much apart from those Democratic groups. You can see that Black people care much more about doing something about gun control than the other groups. So this graphic allows you to see how some groups are prioritizing some issues while other groups are prioritizing other issues, which I think is important and significant. So one last thing I want to do during this talk is kind of convince you that we spend a lot of time reading stories about how we're different on everything. There's a gender gap, there's a generation divide, there's a rural-urban divide, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, one of the implications of what we're doing with this mosaic is we're saying like, we're actually different on a few of these groups are actually quite different from each other, but on most of our social identities, we're not that different at all. And one way I can approach illustrating this is to do the following. So what we did was go into our surveys and randomly select 5,000 Trump voters and 5,000 Harris voters and another 5,000 Trump voters, another 5,000 Harris voters. And we essentially matched them. And we said, okay, if you randomly take a Trump voter and then match that Trump voter with another randomly selected Trump voter, what percentage of the time would they share the same racial or ethnic identity? Okay, so two Trump voters share the same racial or ethnic identity about 58% of the time. Two Kamala Harris voters share the same racial or ethnic identity 42% of the time. Now that makes sense because the Democratic Party is much more racially diverse than the Republican Party is. And if you select one Trump voter and one Harris voter, they share the same racial or ethnic identity 36% of the time. Now that probably fits with your imagination of what's going on in America, and that Harris voters look very different from Trump voters. But we actually don't see that when we look at lots of other identities. So when you look at, for example, educational attainment, actually, a Harris voter is more likely to share the same educational attainment with another Trump voter than they are with a or with a Trump voter than they are with another Harris voter. Okay, 33% of the time, two Harris voters have the same education, whereas 37% of the time, a Trump and a Harris voter have the same education. They're about as likely to share the same religious identity. A Harris voter is about the same likely to share the same religious identity with another Harris voter as they are with a Trump voter. They're slightly more likely to have the same gender identity with another Harris voter than with a Trump voter. But they're actually much less likely to share the same sexual identity with another Harris voter than with another Trump voter. And when you sort of sum all these up, what you get is that, again, the Republican Party is more homogenous, so it's maybe not surprising that Trump voters share more in common with each other than they do with Harris voters. But Harris voters share about the same number of identities in common with other Harris voters than they do with Trump voters. Okay, so it's true that there are some important identities that divide us, but we actually look a lot alike the other side on lots of other identities. So that's one thing I want to emphasize. So that's sort of the final lesson I want to throw out there, which is that we share much more in common than we might realize. And really to drive this point home, I want to finally share one last graph, and then I'll sort of leave it at that. In 2022, we asked about 11,000 CES respondents. We asked a very simple question, and it's just an open-ended question. It's just, all we asked was, what's the most important thing that happened in your life in the past year? So we weren't asking specifically about politics. We just kind of want to know what's going on in your life. And if you plot, basically I've had my research assistants code the answers into these categories. And for most of these categories, what you're seeing is that most of these groups are basically dealing with the same things in life. There are a few occasions where there's an outlier, but when you look at things like, a pretty common one is people talking about the death of a family member or a friend, for example. That's down closer to the bottom. All these groups are dealing with that in life, right? All these groups are dealing with retirement or economic issues or, getting married or getting divorced, having children, et cetera, et cetera. That the things we experience in our daily lives, again, are not that different from the other groups who are otherwise quite polarized in our society. And so I'll just leave you with that. And even better is that I'll leave you with this, which is a way for you, if you are interested, to just open up our data and look response by response at what people said when we asked them this question, because I actually think I pass several minutes every day sort of scrolling through some of these responses. Some of them are quite sweet. A bunch of them report having fallen in love in the past year, which is a nice way to end this talk. And the percentage of people who say they fell in love is pretty much evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans. So again, there's something we can find common ground on. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So what we're going to do now is open the floor up for questions for Professor Schaffner. So what we're going to do here is, if you're in the room and you have a question, there should be some index cards on your table. So feel free to write your question on an index card, and we'll have sort of runners going around to collect them and bring them up to me. If you're joining us on Zoom, just put your question into the Q&A, and I'll try to pull questions from each group. I'll just ask an initial question while everyone comes up with their questions that I was interested in. I was really struck by your finding about the sort of ideological heterogeneity of views among white evangelicals. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some examples of issues that they're more liberal on, or sort of what more you can tell us about the behavior and the surprising, to me at least, diversity of views within that group.
Yeah, I think actually that really comes down to what we would maybe term like economic or social welfare issues. There are a lot of white evangelicals who, for example, favor a $15 minimum wage, who favored the Infrastructure Act, who favor even Medicare for all. I think, if you think about when I think about that ideological diversity, I almost think it's in some ways kind of like a microcosm of like, or you could think of J.D. Vance as a microcosm of that. Like he actually believes in some pretty progressive social welfare policies, even while taking some quite conservative positions, obviously on other things like immigration. And I think that actually is a really good kind of summary of what you see when you look at evangelicals. So that there are a lot of evangelicals who are just conservative on pretty much everything, but there are some who actually are pretty liberal when it comes to social welfare issues, but then quite conservative when it comes to stuff like immigration, crime, abortion, etc. And I think that's where you're getting that ideological diversity.
So I have a question from somebody in the room asking whether you find many unique geographical effects within these groups, or are the regions like the South simply polarized because they're full of people from these polarized groups?
Great question. And actually, one thing, sorry. Yeah. Okay. So one thing we've done, one graph I didn't show because I can't show everything, is what we've done is we've said, like, once you control for the big four, how big a difference do you see on every other variable that you might be interested in? Education, geography, region, etc. And for the most part, those differences really shrink and sometimes are basically nothing. So region, much of why our regions are distinct are really about the big four. And you can really think about that. Like I think one really good case of this is just think about the South. We often think about the South as sort of like ground zero for sort of a lot of the polarization and I don't know, culture wars that the country is experiencing. And it's basically the one it's one area of the country where there's a pretty high percentage of Black people, and there's also a pretty high percentage of white evangelicals. Obviously the highest percentage anywhere else in the country. And there even are a lot of secular individuals who are living like in the suburbs of cities like Atlanta, et cetera. So the South is, I think the politics are especially heated because actually the big four make up a much higher share of the electorate in the South than they do in any other region of the country. So in other regions of the country, the Mosaic middle is a bigger share of people, but actually in the South, it's a much smaller share. So you could think partly like, the contentiousness we see when we think about like politics in the South, especially, is partly a function of these groups and the extent to which they exist down there in the South. And but the regional differences themselves really do shrink once you account for the big four. In fact, I have some graphs where I show the mosaic, but with these other categories: education, urban, rural, north, south, northeast, or northeast, south, midwest, west, and it's basically like there's very little variance within those blocks. So once you account for those blocks, things like region, education, urban, rural actually don't, it's not like they're not important. Like they produce maybe 10 or 15 point gaps in how people vote, but it's nothing like the gaps that we see across those four groups.
Thank you. So building on what you just said, we have a question from someone in the room sort of who was struck by how unimportant the urban-rural divide was and what you were saying, and sort of wanted to know more about whether the fascination with the divide in the media and among the public is due to a fixation on something visual about the maps and sort of what that tells us. And can you sort of speak to sort of why you think that is relative to sort of its unimportance in what you are showing us in terms of the data?
Yeah. That's a really good question. So first off, let me just say that if you go back to that graph where I'm plotting the importance of variables over time, actually, we have urban-rural for the whole time period, but we only actually started asking people to identify their own place, sort of whether they live in an urban or rural area in 2018. Before that, we're basically just sort of using where we know they live and kind of categorizing where they live. And you'll see that actually, like, you get a tick up in the most recent elections. And part of that's actually because if you self-identify into an urban or rural geography, some of that is correlated with politics. So there's definitely something political about where people live. There's definitely some great research on like rural identity and the extent to which that's tied in with politics. That said, a lot of the urban-rural divide is simply that, for example, white evangelicals live in rural areas. A lot of Black people live in urban areas. A lot of secular people live in urban areas. And so once you account, a lot of LGBTQ live in urban areas. So once you account for that fact, the difference between rural and urban voting really does shrink quite a bit. And yes, I think like there is something nice about looking at a map and being able to see like the maps that that Barry showed when he was discussing the election earlier. Like there's something very visually appealing about that. And in fact, Steve, my co-author, was just texting me this week saying, we've got to map the big four. We have to create maps of the big four. And so it's almost like we've done this and we've kind of shown that like it kind of swamps the importance of geography, but then there's still this like impetus that we have to be like, but now we need to show it on a map.
We have a question from someone online who wanted to know more about what the correlation was between the secular group and education level.
Right. Yeah. A lot of the secular group are more highly educated individuals. So there's definitely a correlation between education and especially like the difference between evangelical and secular. So secular individuals are much more likely to have college or postgraduate degrees. White evangelicals are much more likely to not have a college degree or have only or even less than a high school degree. But I think what our analysis is showing is that it's the religion that matters more than the education. And again, it's not to say education doesn't matter, because it still does kind of end up, I think, fourth in terms of like in predicting 2024 presidential vote. It's sort of like the fourth most important thing. It's not that it's not important. It's just that like once you account for the big four, there's no educational group within any of those big four groups, or even within the Mosaic middle, that votes anywhere near 70% for either side. That there definitely is this association between education and religion, but it seems like it's the religion aspect that maybe matters more.
We have a question from someone in the room who's asking, how much does the Mosaic tell us about the nationalization of both parties, or nationalization of American politics?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that's a good question. Let's think about that for a second. I mean, I think what it does do is it kind of allows us to see that that like the things that really matter, the things that really divide us, are more about identity and less about geography. So if you find an atheist in rural Georgia, that person's still much more likely to be a Democrat than a Republican. And if you find an evangelical in Boston, that person's actually more likely to be a Republican than a Democrat. And so I think because of the way parties build coalitions now, from kind of, if you think about it from the top down, that it's more that these groups kind of have a voice as identity groups rather than sort of bubbling up from the states and localities. So I think that would be my best attempt at answering that question. It's a great question. I haven't really honestly thought that much about that aspect of it.
We have another question about evangelicals. So a question asking sort of what factors help explain why evangelicals vote contrary to their policy preferences? And I guess I would actually add another question about sort of what, do you think this is a group that maybe Democrats should be thinking about trying to reach out to, given the heterogeneity of their views?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. It's something I've really been thinking about a lot. So I don't think evangelicals are voting contrary to their views. I think that what issues they're voting on are maybe the ones where they're the more conservative. So so again, I said I mentioned or I showed that like evangelicals, really care about sort of, for example, or tend to care about the abortion issue. They tend to care about crime. They tend to care about immigration. On those issues, they're pretty conservative. It's actually on the more economic issues where they're more moderate or liberal. So what does that mean? I think in some ways there's like a really interesting story here that I haven't fully grappled with, which kind of maybe ties in with maybe sort of you can almost think of it as like the post-material era of American politics, where we have a pretty strong social safety net in America at this point. It's pretty robust to changes in administration and whatnot. And in some ways, even though you can kind of like explain a lot of the 2024 outcome based on the economy and inflation, economic issues just aren't necessarily what people are always voting on. And maybe partly that's because like a lot on the big economic issues that have come up, a lot of times there's more agreement than we realize. That really what politics has become about are more of these, I guess you'd say, like cultural identity issues. So again, immigration, crime, et cetera. And when we look at, for example, the relationship between the issue positions of each of these groups and how they vote, what we see is that, like for evangelicals, their positions on things like immigration and crime are much more strongly correlated with how they vote than on like economic issues. And I think part of that's just because like most white evangelicals in America are, have, they, unemployment's low, they have jobs, there's social safety net, et cetera. Like when we had a once in a lifetime pandemic that drove up unemployment to ridiculous, like really high, historic levels, the federal government was able to quite easily pass bipartisan legislation to address that pandemic. And one of the reasons is that evangelicals aren't opposed to big government interventions like that to secure the social safety net in a time of crisis. But at the same time, like their party kind of reflected that view by kind of going along with that legislation. So I think it's more that it's not that they're voting against their views necessarily, it's just that they're prioritizing some issues over others, and it's the issues where they're more conservative. I do think it is kind of interesting to think about like the fact that how much, for example, how the election turned out, it was a lot about inflation, and think about also but it was also a lot about immigration. I think a lot of people were upset with the Biden administration's performance on immigration, and that would have been especially true among evangelicals. And Kamala Harris, focused a lot on the abortion issue, and again, those probably weren't the issues that were going to win over evangelical votes. So I think in terms of should Democrats be going after some of those votes, I think so, but I think to do that, you're going to have to talk about different issues. So maybe things like a minimum wage or reducing, regulations on small businesses, things that are like that might appeal to that group more.
We had a couple of questions from people in the room interested in understanding how your big Mosaic groups have views on specific issues. So it's specific issues being abortion and being sort of democracy or democratic reform, stability, preservation issues. Could you talk a little bit about how your big groups feel on both of those issues?
Yeah, well, definitely on abortion. We actually this year asked, we have a battery of abortion questions we ask, which are sort of more typical abortion questions. This year we kind of added a new question, excuse me, which was kind of just asking people up to what number of weeks in a pregnancy should a woman be allowed to obtain an abortion. And so you could, each respondent could put in anything between 0 and 40, basically. And what's interesting is if you remember that distribution of issue positions graph that I showed you, if you look at that just for weeks of pregnancy, you'll see that actually white evangelicals are very polarized on that. So they're very much picking a very low number of weeks, and they're pretty unified, that there's a little, actually more variance among secular and LGBTQ respondents, and they're more centered around, like, say, 25 weeks. And maybe the most interesting or telling is that Black people are to the left of the mosaic. I'm sorry, to the right, to the more conservative end. So lower number of weeks compared to the mosaic middle. So Black people as a group prefer abortion be limited to a lower number of weeks on average than the mosaic middle does. So they're actually closer to evangelicals on the abortion issue, at least when we formulate it in that way, than the mosaic middle is. So I think, like, that's definitely an issue. And I've talked about, like, there are some tensions, and I think in the current Democratic coalition, especially when you think about the secular group, which has become quite important in the Democratic coalition, and Black people, which has been this sort of a stalwart of support in the Democratic coalition. That basically there's a big difference between how they view abortion. In terms of democracy, we have some questions this year, but I actually haven't looked at those, so I'm not going to wager a response on that yet.
More than fair. We have a question from Jeff online, who wanted to know, sort of said that there's been a lot written about how education is a greater predictor over time, and also how working class voters have shifted over time, and sort of wonders whether your data speaks to either of these time trends that we've seen talked about so much.
Yeah, so I do think so. Obviously we hear a lot about the diploma divide, and it's not that it's like not important. Again, it's just like not one of the two most important things. If you go back to that first graph I showed you, the New York Times spent 0 pages of ink talking about atheist or agnostic voters, even though they are a big chunk who votes so reliably Democratic. They're obviously pretty important to how elections work in the United States. Education is an interesting one. It's definitely, like, become more important, especially among white people. And I think a lot of the attention it's given is because it's new. Because, a little bit of a gap opened up in among white people, a little bit of an education gap opened up in the early 2000s, and then it really exploded in 2016. It's kind of like stayed big during that time. But again, even then, we're talking about maybe like a 20-point gap or so in how people vote between college and non-college whites. And, the gaps we're talking about among the big four are sort of so much bigger than that. And a lot of a fair portion of that education gap, again, comes down actually to religion rather than maybe education itself. What I would say is education is definitely important. It's just, if you were trying to predict beyond the big four how people were going to vote, and you were using education, it wouldn't be that good of a predictor of how someone's going to vote. Like, you'd be able to do better than, like, flipping a coin, but not like much better than flipping a coin. And so I think, again, the education divide is, yes, it's important and interesting, but it's just, again, still dwarfed by these more long-standing patterns that we see among the big four.
We have several questions asking about sort of how we think about sort of bringing the country together. So especially with, some groups or parties trying to divide on the basis of identity issues and not policy issues. And sort of how do you think about what your findings tell us about the potential to bring the country together? Or, another question about sort of how do we communicate these findings to the voters to try to depoliticize the public to sort of show some areas of similarity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, honestly, we haven't done that work, but there's been some good work coming out of the polarization lab at Stanford, where people have tested the extent to which you can maybe reduce negative attitudes towards the other side by doing things like emphasizing similarities rather than differences. And I think there's definitely something to that. We're kind of trying to take it, as I showed you, a step further, not just talking about, obviously I'm talking about, like, isn't it striking that actually, when it comes to these 6 identities, you look just as much like a Trump voter as you do like another Harris voter? Like, that's maybe worth thinking about. But I think it's even more useful to think about sort of the things that are happening in people's lives and how similar those things are. So, divorce, marriage, death, sickness, like, if you look through these responses, you see, these difficult things people are dealing with, sometimes these joyful things that people are dealing with, and very little relationship to whether you're a Democrat or Republican in terms of the extent to which you're dealing with those things. So I think one thing I would say is that I feel like politics has become a little bit divorced from the things in our lives. So, my colleague Eitan Hirsch has a book where he talks about how a lot of people see politics more as a game, kind of a way to blow off steam, a hobby, etc. I think there's definitely something to that, where a lot of people maybe don't think that what happens in elections actually makes that much of a difference in their lives, and so it becomes more about this teamsmanship, and so the impetus is to basically sort of demonize or see difference in the other side. I think the news media obviously reinforces that by focusing endlessly on all the things that divide us, which is unnatural. But I think if you think about one thing we're asking people right now as we're out in the field is, what's one thing that the federal government do that could make your own personal life better? Because what we're kind of interested in is to what extent are people even thinking about politics from the perspective of fixing things in their own lives? We see lots of stories from these questions that we've asked of people who are dealing with real heartache. There's a woman in Florida who said that she was taking our survey to distract herself from the fact that her that her daughter had just been diagnosed with cancer and was going to have to start undergoing treatment for cancer. She was taking our survey to distract her from that, how worried she was about that. She's reports an income of about $30,000. She's on disability. She's a single mom, and she's a huge Trump voter. I think you can find a lot of empathy in what this woman's going through if you're a Harris supporter before you get to the fact that she's a Trump voter. And she's a Trump voter because she's evangelical and she goes to church a lot. I think, again, part of it is the environment that we live in, the extent to which the media emphasizes difference. It'd be nice if there's more effort paid to emphasizing similarity. Part of it's our own motivations, us wanting to see difference in the other side. I'll finish this answer by saying that my mother-in-law was here visiting to help us with our daughter a couple of weeks ago, and she was relaying to me a story about this woman in her community who she volunteers with, who she really admires, who she feels like such a kinship with, who she had nominated for this award, this charitable award, and the woman had won the award, and then my mother-in-law showed up to the event, which was at the woman's house, and was shocked to find out that she had a Trump flag flying in front of her house, because she felt like this woman was basically almost like an ideal version of herself. She felt so much connection to this person, and then was shocked to find out that they were a Trump voter. And for her, it really, she couldn't wrap her head around it. And so the lesson there is sort of maybe we don't stop at that. We sort of go to the next step of trying to better understand, why there's that difference, where that comes from, and maybe how we can bridge that.
We have a couple questions for you about the Mosaic middle. One person is asking sort of how big it is, what percentage of the US population it is. And then we also have questions, just could you give us some examples of what that mosaic looks like, or,
who's in there?
Should think about them?
Yeah. So the Mosaic middle is about 40 to 45% of the population. So it used to be much bigger. So it actually used to be a majority of American voters, but as the secular group has increased, as the LGBTQ population has increased in size, and it's shrunk. So there's a lot of, Jewish people are in there because we could set them aside as also a Democratic group, but they're actually so small that it almost doesn't really make sense to think of them as this sort of individual group. And some Jewish, conservative Jews actually fairly voted quite a lot for Trump in 2024. There, like a lot of Catholics end up in that group, so so a lot of heterosexual Catholics. Sorry, I'm going back to my notes about this. If you look at the tiles in that section, I think there's about 180 or so in the Mosaic middle. 9 of them are 70% or more Republican. It's mostly like less educated men who heterosexual men who have low levels of education, and then there's 43 much smaller tiles in there that are at least 70% Democratic. So these would be people like Jewish people, some, for example, like Asian Americans would be in there, some Hispanic Americans. I think that would be kind of define those. And then the rest are very much purple. So you could think of people like, I don't know, Catholic women with a college degree or something like that, who are pretty 50-50 in terms of how they vote.
Great. And then we'll just wrap up with one last question that I promise isn't a plant, but will warm the heart of any academic, which is this research summarized in a paper that is publicly available? And do you expect a book to be published soon? And where can we learn more about it?
We actually don't have a paper, believe it or not. We are working on the book right now. Actually, right now we're working with an agent on a book proposal. So our aim is to write a book that is going to be for a trade press, so for a more general audience. So it's something neither of us has necessarily experienced that, as sort of writing for a more general audience, translating our findings for people in that way. We're working with a book agent on sort of really refining what we're doing. And I think the idea is going to be not just to limit this to looking at politics, but actually expanding it to look at sort of how we can think about the Mosaic in terms of how it really reflects American society more generally as well. So that book, the goal is to have a draft of that done in about a year, but the real goal is to basically have that book come out in advance of the 2026 midterm elections. So stay tuned. Hopefully in the meantime, we'll get a paper or two out online somewhere, but really we're focused on the book right now. So yeah, thanks for the prod.
Well, great. Well, please join me in thanking Professor Schaffner.
Thank you all. Sorry again, I couldn't be there in person, but I really enjoyed it.